Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're doing something a bit different, actually.
Yeah, we're really digging into not just the what happened in a specific case, but the why and the how behind the defense.
Exactly. We're looking at the architecture of denial, you could say. How identity, particularly religious conviction, and the way people construct their story, how that all slams into a forensic investigation.
It's about motive and meaning, really, not just recounting events. We're looking at the very sophisticated layers of psychological, even philosophical barriers that can make the central truth, well, almost impossible to get at with just external evidence.
Right, these defensive frameworks. And we've kind of zeroed in on three key strategies, these interconnected ways this structure gets built. First, how faith itself is deployed, really as both a logical shield and a psychological fortress.
Yeah.
Second, we'll look at something we're calling selective sanctification. It's quite tactical how allies are sort of identified and brought into the fold.
Right, the conditions for cooperation.
And third, this really fascinating mechanism, claiming convenient hostility, basically building a persecution narrative that seriously complicates the whole justice process.
It's an incredible look at human psychology under pressure, whether it's conscious strategy or just a deeply ingrained unconscious defense, the effect is often the same.
It shifts the whole game, doesn't it? Takes it out of the realm of facts, evidence.
And puts it squarely into the realm of spiritual certainty or, self-identity. Suddenly it's not what does the evidence say, it's how dare you question my faith, my character.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What really happens when an investigation tries to grapple with that? When facts meet, well, absolute certainty.
So the foundation, the sort of core strategy we see is this move to turn just profound loss, chaos, ambiguity into something clear, ultimate clarity. And the way that's done is by invoking God.
Right.
In this specific case, that single move instantly reframed everything. It wasn't a police procedural anymore, sifting through evidence.
It became something else entirely.
Exactly. A moral drama governed by faith, by what they knew to be true internally. Hashtag 1.1, the logical and philosophical defense.
That's incredibly powerful because it gives the person under scrutiny immediate control, doesn't it? Over the narrative, at least. Yeah. It's like refusing to live in a world where the truth is messy or maybe unknowable.
It replaces that forensic uncertainty with spatial certainty. Let's get into the mechanics of that control, maybe starting with the logic.
Okay. We hear it so often in these situations, right? I swear to God, I didn't do it. You call this a logical category error. Can you break that down for us? What's the actual error there?
Sure. It's basically mixing apples and oranges, truth-wise. In any kind of legal or scientific setting, we're after factual truth, what philosophers might call correspondence truth.
Meaning, does the claim match the reality? Can we check it?
Precisely. It has to be falsifiable, verifiable. If I say the sky is green, you can look up and check. That claim corresponds or doesn't to reality.
But bringing God into it changes the category.
Completely. I swear to God operates in a different realm altogether. This is moral truth. It's about spiritual conviction, internal sincerity. It's fundamentally unfalsifiable.
You can't subpoena God to check if the oath was, really sincere in God's eyes.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can't use DNA evidence to disprove someone's internal moral state or their belief. So the error, the logical category error, is treating these two distinct things, the factual, testable claim and the moral, untestable conviction, as if they're the same kind of evidence.
So when someone makes that oath, it might absolutely prove they believe they're innocent, like utterly convinced in their own heart.
It speaks to the sincerity of their belief, yes. But critically, it says nothing definitive about the accuracy of that belief in objective reality. Someone in deep denial, someone who is compartmentalized, even potentially a very calculated liar, they can all swear that oath with apparent conviction.
And strategically, what does that do to the investigation?
It shifts the burden. Suddenly, the investigator isn't just dealing with evidence that needs to meet the beyond reasonable doubt standard. By questioning the statement, they risk appearing to question the person's sacred moral core, their relationship with God.
It makes skepticism look like blasphemy, almost.
It's a very clever, maybe even unconscious sleight of hand. It puts the investigator in an incredibly awkward, potentially damaging position, especially publicly.
Which ties into this other idea you brought up, the preference for coherence truth over correspondence truth. We get correspondence matching facts. What's coherence truth?
Coherence truth is about how well a belief fits within your existing system of beliefs, your identity, your worldview. For the family in question, their innocence cohered perfectly with everything they believed about themselves.
They saw themselves as good, moral, Christian people, loving parents.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea they could be involved was simply incoherent. It didn't fit the picture.
Exactly. To them, their innocence wasn't a hypothesis to be tested against evidence. It was self-evident, a foundational truth that their entire sense of self rested upon.
And that makes it almost completely immune to external evidence, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If your innocence is a core part of your identity, facts that contradict it just bounce off.
It creates a kind of philosophical shield. You have to ask, does that kind of deep coherence-based certainty actually help find the truth? Or does it become an obstacle because it makes the person's own conviction unshakable, regardless of contradictory facts?
It seems like it privileges self-perception above all else. Hashtag tag 1.2, psychological and physiological fortifications.
And this philosophical stance gets cemented psychologically. You see it so clearly in Patsy Ramsey's famous line, something like, "I don't give a darn how scientific it is, I didn't do it."
That's a pretty stark statement. It sounds like pure defiance.
It's what we'd call belief superiority. The internal feeling, the conviction, just overrides any external data, no matter how objective or scientific.
But you're suggesting it might not just be conscious stonewalling.
It could be deeper than that. For people whose entire identity, their social standing, their self-worth, is deeply interwoven with a strong religious or moral framework, the idea of being involved in something horrific like this isn't just factually wrong, it's existentially impossible.
Like it literally cannot compute.
Right. The brain might activate profound denial mechanisms. It builds this incredibly strong psychological fortress. Inside that fortress, their self-understanding is absolute. It can even reshape or suppress memories. This makes standard deception detection, looking for cognitive load or inconsistencies, almost useless.
Because they genuinely believe their own narrative at that deep psychological level.
Wow. And how does the body play into this? You mentioned John Ramsey's composure during questioning those "I swear to God" moments. Some saw it as cold, others as innocent calm.
Well, we need to look at the physiology. Invoking deeply held faith, especially in a moment of extreme stress, is a powerful tool for emotional regulation. It can actually trigger the body's parasympathetic nervous system.
The rest and digest system, not fight or flight. Exactly. So instead of seeing panic, agitation, the things we might instinctively associate with lying under pressure, you can get this calm, composed certainty. It's a physiological opposite of what you might expect from someone under that kind of scrutiny if they were hiding something.
So the calmness is real, physiologically.
Yeah.
But it's ambiguous. It could mean genuine innocence.
Or it could mean incredibly effective, perhaps well-practiced emotional self-regulation achieved through that religious framing. The person feels anchored in their faith, and their body responds with calm.
And that's why polygraph can be so tricky with deeply religious people.
It's a huge factor. Their profound belief in their own truth, whether that truth aligns with objective facts or not, can generate the physiological signals of truth-telling. They aren't consciously lying to themselves or to their God at that moment, and the polygraph needle reflects that internal state, not necessarily the external reality.
It's fascinating. The body confirms the belief. But forensically, that's a nightmare.
It is, because the physiological signs for genuine innocence and for deeply convinced denial can look identical. It neutralizes a key investigative tool. Hashtag 1.3 forensic and anthropological impact. So, from a purely forensic standpoint, using these strong assertions of faith, it functions as a very effective, maybe unintentional, maybe not, obstruction technique.
How so?
Investigators need claims they can test.
Okay.
Falsifiable statements. "I was here at this time. I saw this." Religious assertions, "God knows I'm innocent," immediately shift the ground to the unfalsifiable.
You can't cross-examine God. It just stops the forensic inquiry cold on that point.
It creates a dead end. And more than that, there's a social cost to pushing back too hard.
Right. You risk looking like you're attacking their faith.
Exactly. Which can trigger community backlash, negative media attention, accusations of bias. It creates this kind of protected space around the subject that investigators are very hesitant to breach because of the potential fallout. It becomes politically risky.
And this effect is magnified by their social standing, their cultural capital, right? The Ramseys weren't just anyone. They were affluent, respected members of their community.
Absolutely. That's the anthropological layer of protection. When they invoked their Christianity, their status, they weren't just making personal statements. They were tapping into a whole cultural system that values that kind of identity, that associates it with trustworthiness, with being good people.
It creates an instant in-group, out-group dynamic.
Yes. Their community, people who shared that status and faith, naturally felt a sense of solidarity. Seeing people like us subjected to this kind of scrutiny felt wrong. It violated norms. So this social protection bubble forms, and it operates almost entirely separate from the actual evidence in the case. It's about shared identity.
So what we're seeing is this complex structure where genuine belief and potentially sophisticated defense strategies look exactly the same from the outside. Both create this incredibly resistant barrier.
That's the core dilemma. The patterns are identical.
Okay, so we've looked at the internal fortress. Now let's shift to how they manage the external environment, the investigators themselves. This is where it gets, as you said, really interesting behaviorally. Because if faith is this absolute guiding principle, you might expect, well, maybe transparency or at least consistent engagement with everyone involved in finding the truth. But that's not quite what we see.
No. What we observe is what we're terming selective sanctification, a distinct pattern where cooperation, things like sharing information, expressing fellowship, even praying together, seemed contingent.
Contingent on what?
Contingent on whether the investigator accepted their narrative, specifically the intruder theory. We see a stark difference in interaction with someone like Detective Lou Smith, who championed the intruder theory, versus others who remain skeptical. #, 2.1 logic, philosophy, and the terms of agreement. Logically, this raises questions. If your faith is truly the bedrock of how you navigate a crisis, shouldn't it apply universally? Shouldn't you, in theory, extend grace, or at least engage openly, even with those who doubt you, in service of the greater truth?
But if cooperation is switched on, only when someone agrees with your version of events.
It suggests that faith isn't just operating as a principle, but perhaps as a strategy. It becomes a tool to validate allies and invalidate dissenters.
A marker of trustworthiness. You're only worthy of our religious fellowship or our cooperation if you first sign on to our story.
That's the implication. It moves away from faith as a transcendent guide and towards what philosophers might call instrumental religiosity. Meaning using the language, symbols, and affiliations of religion to achieve essentially secular goals, like identifying who's on your side, building support, managing the flow of information, excluding opponents. Religion becomes a means to an end rather than the end itself.
So praying with Lou Smith, for example, wasn't just a shared spiritual moment. It also functioned to solidify an alliance with a sympathetic investigator.
It could be interpreted that way. It creates a kind of tribal dynamic. Instead of faith bridging divides, it reinforces them. Us, believers in the narrative, fellow Christians who support us, versus them, skeptics, the hostile police.
Which makes it hard to argue the spiritual framework was truly separate from the defensive strategy. It seems like they became intertwined.
It raises that very critical question. Did the spiritual framework guide the defense, or did the defense utilize the spiritual framework? # 2.2 psychology of splitting and physiological calibration. Psychologically, this kind of conditional relationship fits a pattern known as splitting. It's a defense mechanism, often unconscious.
What does splitting involve?
It's basically dividing the world, especially people, into simplistic black and white categories. You're either all good, an ally, trustworthy, like Smith in this view, or you're all bad, an enemy, biased, a threat, like the skeptical police.
It gets rid of the gray areas, the ambiguity.
Exactly, which is very effective at reducing anxiety in a high-stress, threatening situation. It gives you clear rules. Trust this person, stonewall that person.
And this serves a purpose whether you're innocent or guilty, right?
Yes. If someone is guilty, splitting helps them manage the situation. Cultivate supporters, neutralize threats. If someone is innocent but feels deeply misunderstood, attacked, or is perhaps traumatized, splitting can emerge as a more primitive defense against perceived persecution.
But from the outside, the behavior that dividing people into camps looks identical.
That's the key point again. The underlying reason might be different, but the observable strategy of splitting looks the same.
And just like with the faith assertions, the body responds to this split.
Absolutely. The physiological stress response likely calibrates to the perceived threat level of the person they're interacting with.
So with Smith, who they saw as an ally,
you'd expect to see physiological signs of reduced stress, lower cortisol, perhaps more warmth, openness in body language. They feel safer.
But with investigators, they perceived as skeptical or hostile.
You'd likely see the opposite. Elevated stress hormones, a more guarded posture, tension, maybe even physiological signs of anger or fear. Their body goes into threat response mode.
But again, the stress is real. The feeling of being attacked is real to them.
But it doesn't necessarily mean the investigator's behavior was objectively hostile. It means they perceived it that way. Their body responds to their subjective interpretation, not the objective reality of the interaction.
So the physiological stress proves they felt persecuted, but not necessarily that they were being persecuted in the way they claimed.
Precisely. The body validates the feeling, which then reinforces the belief that the skeptics are enemies, justifying the splitting and the selective cooperation. It's a feedback loop. #HagTag 2.3 Forensic and Criminal Mindset Implications.
Okay, let's put on our forensic criminology hat. This strategy, cultivating the sympathetic, shutting out the skeptical, how does that play out in terms of the actual investigation?
It's hugely impactful. A unified investigation is critical, especially in complex cases like this that rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, interviews, behavioral analysis.
And Smith's support fractured that unity.
Enormously. It provided a credible internal counter-narrative within law enforcement itself. It sowed doubt, created conflict between investigators and agencies. This division is strategically invaluable for any defendant because it inherently creates ambiguity.
And ambiguity is the foundation of reasonable doubt.
Exactly. So forensically, we have to analyze. Was this division just a natural, inevitable result of a difficult case with differing opinions, or was it actively cultivated and amplified by a defense strategy that rewarded agreement with access and punished skepticism with withdrawal?
The pattern of contingent cooperation strongly suggests the latter, doesn't it?
It aligns very closely with what we call selective disclosure, a common tactic in managing guilt or controlling a narrative. You feed information and access to those who support your story, effectively shaping their perspective.
And you starve the skeptics.
You starve the skeptical lines of inquiry. They don't get the same access, the same level of cooperation, the some nuances of information needed to fully develop or test their hypotheses.
So the intruder theory gets nurtured, while other possibilities wither on the vine due to lack of access.
That's the functional outcome. Regardless of the ultimate truth, this selective approach ensures that only the preferred narrative has the resources and access to become fully formed and publicly dominant. It compromises the investigation's ability to explore all avenues equally.
It's a masterful way to control the flow, using trust and access as leverage.
Okay, this leads us directly to the third pillar of this defensive architecture. This is the claim, made early and often, that the police were hostile, biased, had tunnel vision, and were out to get the family from the very beginning.
A very powerful claim, especially when dealing with grieving parents.
Extremely powerful. But we have to step back and rationally examine the objective record. Does it actually support this pervasive narrative of immediate, overt hostility? Or is the narrative itself serving a different, more strategic function?
The first thing that strikes me about this claim is its unfalsifiability. It seems impossible to disprove.
How?
Well, if the police do act in a way that could be interpreted as firm or skeptical, that's presented as proof positive of hostility. See, they were biased.
Right.
But if the police act professionally, calmly, by the book, that's explained away too. Oh, they were just hiding their real intentions. They were secretly hostile.
It's a classic catch-22. The claim of bias becomes impervious to evidence. Any data point can be framed to fit the narrative. Logically, the burden of proof should be on showing the hostility occurred.
But instead, the dynamic flips. The police are constantly having to prove they weren't hostile, while the subjective feeling of being attacked is taken as fact.
And when you look closely at the early interactions, many things cited as hostility seem like standard, if uncomfortable, investigative procedure.
Like Officer French asking early on if JonBenet might have run away, or asking for formal interviews promptly.
Exactly. These are necessary questions, standard protocols in a missing person turned homicide case. But within the defensive framework, they were immediately interpreted not as procedure, but as accusation, as an attack on their character and status. #tag 3.1 unfalsifiability and the subjective reality gap. This really highlights the clash between two different kinds of truth again. Phenomenological truth versus objective truth.
Phenomenological meaning, their lived experience, how it felt to them.
Yes. For the Ramseys, it felt like persecution. It felt like they were under attack from biased police. Therefore, in their reality, it was persecution, and their defensive reactions were justified. That's their phenomenological truth.
But the investigators were operating from a different place.
They were operating, ideally, from objective truth, following procedures, gathering evidence, asking necessary questions, even if those questions were painful or seemed accusatory to the subjects.
And these two realities, this is subjective feeling and the objective procedure, they just couldn't align. They were speaking different languages.
completely incommensurable. One side is talking about procedural necessity, the other is talking about emotional injury and perceived intent. This creates a fundamental impasse.
And it forces a really difficult question for the justice system, doesn't it? Especially with high-profile, high-status individuals who've suffered trauma. How much should an investigation bend its objective procedures to accommodate the subject's feeling of being persecuted, especially when that feeling might be, well, strategically convenient?
Or genuinely felt but based on a misinterpretation. It's a massive dilemma. Accommodate too much and you compromise the investigation. Maintain strict protocol and you risk being labeled hostile and biased, potentially damaging the case in the public eye or even legally. The claim of hostility puts the investigators in a no-win situation. Hashtag 3.2 psychological attribution and embodied experience. Psychologically, what's likely driving this interpretation of hostility, even in the face of neutral behavior?
You mentioned trauma making threat detection systems hyperactive.
Yes, that's a big part of it. After a catastrophic event, especially one involving loss and intense external scrutiny, the brain can shift into hypervigilance mode. There's a tendency towards hostile attribution bias.
Meaning you're more likely to interpret ambiguous signals as threatening.
Exactly. A neutral facial expression, a standard question, a detective taking notes, things that are just part of the job, can be perceived through a lens of fear and suspicion as aggressive, doubting, or malicious.
And once that perception takes hold, they think I did it, confirmation bias kicks in.
Absolutely. The brain then starts actively looking for evidence to confirm that belief. It highlights the skeptical question, the firm tone, the lack of overt sympathy,
while downplaying or ignoring the routine, professional, maybe even supportive interactions.
Right. The brain constructs a reality that fits the dominant emotion, which in this case is often fear, grief, and perhaps a feeling of being unjustly accused. Again, this isn't necessarily conscious manipulation. It's a known cognitive bias under extreme stress.
And looping back to the body, this perceived attack triggers real physical responses.
Yes. Even if the hostility is imagined or exaggerated, the feeling of being attacked is real. That triggers the physiological stress response, adrenaline, cortisol, muscle tension.
Fight or flight.
Right. And this creates that powerful self-reinforcing cycle we talked about. The body's stress signals provide visceral proof that the perception of attack is accurate. I feel stressed, therefore I must be under attack. It makes the subjective reality feel objectively, physically true.
Their own bodies confirm the persecution narrative, making it almost impossible for them to see it any other way.
It solidifies the conviction that the investigators are the enemy. Hashtag 3.3 forensic strategy and weaponized victimhood.
Okay, let's look at the utility of this narrative. From a purely strategic forensic perspective, what does claiming early police hostility do for a potential suspect, regardless of guilt or innocence?
Oh, it's incredibly useful. It serves multiple crucial defensive functions right off the bat. First, it provides an immediate justification for any lack of cooperation. If you believe the police are biased and out to get you, then refusing interviews, demanding lawyers, controlling access isn't obstruction, it's necessary self-protection. It reframes non-cooperation as prudence.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Second, and this is huge, it preemptively discredits any future findings that might point towards the family. If damaging evidence emerges later, the defense can always say, well, of course they found that. They were biased from day one. Their entire investigation is tainted.
It poisons the well, basically.
Yeah.
Allows them to cast doubt on anything the hostile police uncover.
Precisely. And when you objectively review the case records, the actual evidence for immediate, overt hostility is often much thinner than the narrative suggests. It seems more subjectively constructed than objectively documented.
Which implies the narrative is serving more of a strategic purpose than a purely descriptive one. It's a shield.
And again, we have to consider the anthropological status barrier. Who gets to make this claim credibly?
You're saying their social standing made the police are hostile narrative easier for the public and media to believe.
Definitely. Think about it. If a marginalized person with a criminal record claims police bias, it's often dismissed. Of course they'd say that. But when affluent, educated, high-status people make the same claim,
they're often given the benefit of the doubt. People think, why would the police persecute them? There must be something to it.
It reveals a potential systemic bias in how readily we accept claims of persecution based on the claimant's social position. It privileges certain voices.
From a criminal mindset perspective, is there a term for setting up this narrative early?
We could call it preemptive reframing. You establish the persecuted victim narrative before the bulk of the evidence is gathered or analyzed. This allows you to control the interpretive lens through which all subsequent information is viewed.
So whatever comes out later is filtered through this police bias frame.
Yes. It limits how prosecutors might proceed, it generates public sympathy, it creates reasonable doubt by suggesting investigator malice. It's incredibly effective.
It effectively weaponizes victimhood. Any attempt by investigators to be thorough or persistent can then be portrayed as further proof of the persecution.
It puts investigators in an impossible bind and provides a powerful, enduring defense regardless of the underlying facts. It's a rhetorical masterstroke in a way. So, pulling all these threads together, what we've really examined today is this remarkable multi-layered architecture of defense. We've seen how faith can be transformed into this logical and psychological fortress, almost impenetrable to external facts. We've looked at how cooperation becomes conditional, used strategically to cultivate allies and isolate skeptics, this selective sanctification.
Right, managing the environment.
And finally, how constructing a narrative of convenient hostility or persecution serves to justify non-cooperation and preemptively discredit unfavorable evidence. It's an incredibly intricate and, frankly, effective structure.
And the really unsettling thing, the ultimate ambiguity we keep circling back to, is that we can't definitively know from the outside which reality this structure represents.
Exactly. Is it the genuine, heartfelt expression of innocent people using their faith and their perception of injustice to navigate an unimaginable nightmare?
Right.
Or is it the most sophisticated, perhaps even unconsciously deployed defense strategy available to someone hiding the truth, expertly leveraging belief, identity, and social dynamics?
Because both possibilities. They produce the exact same observable patterns, the same rhetoric, the same psychological mechanisms, maybe even the same physiological responses.
That's the haunting takeaway. The ambiguity is the strength of the structure. The very things that lend the defense its air of sincerity, the deep conviction, the emotional certainty, the consistency over time, the apparent calm derived from faith, are precisely the elements a highly effective defense strategy would aim to project.
It leaves you wondering if you're seeing the real thing or just a perfectly crafted illusion.
We're left looking at the architecture, but unsure what or who it's truly protecting.
So, for you listening, what does this all mean? Maybe the enduring question isn't just the whodunit. Maybe it's something deeper about how sincerity itself, especially when fortified by identity, by faith, by social standing, can it become the ultimate hiding place?
Can that very conviction, whether grounded in fact or denial, create a framework so strong that it obscures objective truth and perhaps ultimately prevents justice?
It's a question about the nature of belief, evidence, and defense that goes far beyond any single case. And it's definitely something worth thinking about long after this deep dive ends.